We are in Rutledge Park, which was part of the old Cloverdale estate. We're very close to Cloverdale Avenue, which of course takes its name from the estate of Dr. William Fraser Tolmie, one of the founding families of Victoria, a fur trader turned farmer, as well as being a physician. This park at some point had a series of poems engraved into stones, very fittingly, about the Cloverdale estate and its gradual subdivision. He was very interested in agriculture. He imported a lot of trees. Quail, as one of the stones points out, different kinds of cattle. And he was also active as a politician. So he became a MLA. One thing that I think really deserves more attention is he supported the suffrage movement for women and proposed it to the legislature in the 1870s, which of course was decades before it would eventually pass. But it does give you an indication of the women in his life. His wife was, of course, behind him in this, and several of his sisters-in-law as well. And he had many. His wife was one of 8 daughters of the Work family. So very well-connected family. This estate adjoined Hillside Farm, which was the Works, John and Josette Works farm. The estates joined one another, so you would just be traveling from one farm to another. I've always been drawn to the 19th century, and I've always wanted to write a novel. I studied English at university, but I wanted to set a novel here. Of course, a lot of the 19th century novels I studied were set in Britain, a few in the States, but there wasn't a lot in that time period set here. So I started researching, and I had taken some general history courses, but again, it didn't tell me much about Victoria and what it was like here at that time. And I became very intrigued that Victoria was founded, it was a fort before it was a town, and how influential the fur traders were in founding the town, and that they were here before the gold rush, and they lived through that transition, which of course was the focus of my first book, how Victoria changed dramatically almost overnight as the gold seekers started arriving by the shipload, and what it would be like to live in essentially a village outside of a HBC fort, and suddenly to be overrun by mostly Californians in search of gold, and how that changed their social as well as their economic outlook. And that, of course, led to the creation of British Columbia, because Vancouver Island already existed as a colony, but it was down to fur traders like James Douglas to do something about this incursion of Americans who were coming for our resources. It's a challenge in particular writing about women at this time period, because there isn't a lot of direct source material. So I wrote about this in a recent nonfiction chapter that I contributed to a book called Métis Matriarchs. As historian Adele Perry described, looking at the work of Sylvia Van Kirk, who was one of the early researchers on women in the fur trade, you have to look at conventional archives in unconventional ways to draw out the history of women. And so for me, it was coming at it from a lot of different directions. So looking at, in the archives, looking through old BC historical quarterlies, because in the early parts of the 20th century, quite a lot was written about the fur traders. And then looking for footnotes about their families, who, of course, received much less attention. Going through journals of people who visited here. People, like a character in my first novel, Lieutenant at the time, Charles Wilson, who was a royal engineer here with the Boundary Commission. And he wrote about meeting people like the works. And it was really insightful to see the shift in his attitude, which I described in my first novel about, initially he said they were belle sauvage, you know, they were these nearly savages, exaggerating grossly, of course, but how he came to really appreciate them. And then, you know, in the space of just a few months, he's saying they're the kindest people I've ever met. And he was calling Hillside his Western home. So, and by the time he left a few years later, he was criticizing the new arrivals for looking down upon the old settlers, and he said that they by far had the advantage of the newcomers, and described, you know, the pride of the people who were coming and who really had not come from much and were looking down on these people. And I think it was a lot to do with that a lot of the wives had Indigenous heritage, as the fur traders had, for generations, had been marrying Indigenous women and then Métis women, and, you know, daughters of their boss and that kind of thing. Well, having written two novels about the fur trade, well, the work family, but different daughters, the first being at the outset of the Fraser Gold Rush, and the second being the fizzling out and the recession that came from the Caribou Gold Rush fading away and plunging BC into a recession. And then after that, I contributed this nonfiction chapter to Métis Matriarchs. As a departure, I became interested in the family of Queen Victoria. Partly because, well, several of her children were connected to Canada, but in particular, I'm interested in Princess Louise, who came here as the wife of one of our Governor Generals. A bit later period, she was here in the 1880s. But in researching her, and it's a bit easier to research the royal family because so much has been written about them already. But I don't tend to be as interested in the central figures like Queen Victoria herself. My interest in her is more of the impact she had on her children and what it was like for the younger children growing up in the shadow of her mourning and the restrictions. I mean, they already had restrictions based on the lives that they were born into, but this additional layer of grief and not being able to do things that, you know, most normal people would be able to do, like socialize. I mean, it was, even before Prince Albert had died, they were quite careful about who their children mixed with. And then this became exaggerated by the death of their father and suddenly their mother withdrawing from life. And I mean, she didn't even want to spend much time in London. She avoided Buckingham Palace as much as she could and spent time in the other residences and had her ministers coming to visit her in places like Osborne House and on the Isle of Wight or Balmoral. But my interest in Louise in particular, as well as her connection to Canada, was that she really just wanted to be an artist. and she was a very proficient artist, and she was especially interested in sculpture. So, which at the time was considered a very masculine form of art. So, in addition to her barriers of being royalty, it took a lot of persuading from her and the support of her siblings just to get her to art school. And she was one of the only royals to attend a public school of that nature. Her brothers, of course, had studied at university, but in a very kind of detached way. They had their own residences, and but she actually went to the school to learn art, and she practiced it here. There's some existing statues that she did of her mother in Montreal, which of course was, she, as the wife of the Governor General, she spent time in Quebec, Ottawa, of course, which didn't go so well for her, but she loved Victoria. She eventually came out here on a tour. I think it was meant to be a few weeks, and they stayed several months. And she really enjoyed the relative freedom that she found here. And you know, there were some, of course, official events, but she could go out walking. She loved exercise. Would walk into town, go shopping. With a very limited entourage, maybe just with her lady-in-waiting, and enjoyed the relative freedom that Victoria offered.